Today's daf is daf ches, and we'll begin at the very bottom of daf Zayin Amud Beis with Umi Omar Rabbi Lazar Hachi, which is the last two lines on daf Zayin Amud Beis. So let's just review what we know. According to the Shita Rabbi Lazar, if let's say the Kohen is makabel a small volume of dam in one kli, and then he's makabel another small volume of dam in a second kli, and the dam coming out of the neck of the animal into the kli is a kli shores, becomes sanctified when it reaches the kli. But in each kli, he was makabel less than the minimum amount for hazah. So it wasn't royal hazah. So Rabbi Lazar is of the opinion that you cannot combine the two, even if you pour the dam from one kli into the other and combine them, because the kiddush could not take place on less than the shear of kedei hazah. So the Gemara finds a contradiction. Umi Omer Rabbi Lazar Hachi, is it possible that that's Rabbi Lazar's shita? Va'itmar, and this now moves into Menachos, meaning until now we've been talking about Kabbalah's dam in Zvachim, and our sugya is going to see whether or not we derive conclusions from Zvachim to Menachos, because in Menachos, or the other way around, from Menachos to Zvachim, in Menachos is Chavite Kohen Gadol, right? The Kohen Gadol on a daily basis had to bring a carbon mincha, and the word chavitim comes to the word machvas, right? He brought it in a flat pan, and the question is, what happens if he receives in one machvas less than the shear that he needs for the mincha, and in another machvas less than the shear? Is Rabbi Yochanan Omar Eina Kadesha L'Chatzoyin? You can't do a kiddush in the kli L'Chatzoyin, meaning with two separate actions on two separate kalim, or even in one kli, but in two separate actions. But Rabbi Lazar Omar, mitoch shekreva l'chatzoim, kidosha l'chatzoim. Rabbi Lazar is of the opinion that you could be makadesh the mincha l'chatzoim, half and then another half. And the logic that Rabbi Lazar offers here is because kreva l'chatzoim, the chavitin were brought, the minchas chavita was brought half in the morning and half in the evening. So that by definition, in the hakrava, it would be lechatzoyin, and Rabbi Lazar therefore derives the analogy that just like in the hakrava it's lechatzoyin, so too in the kiddush it's lechatzoyin. And now we start daf ches. V'yam isa. Now, if Rabbi Lazar is committed to the position that in dam there's no kiddush lechatzoyin, and yet in menachos he says there is kiddush l'chatzoyin, because again we have to point out here that minchas chavitim in this context becomes the paradigm for all menachos, which Tosfos has a problem with, because it seems that Rabbi Lazar's logic is local to chavit, minchas chavit, because he says it's the akrav is l'chatzoyin. But Tosfos says he's only saying that according to Rabbi Yochanan because he wants Rabbi Yochanan to admit that at least in the case of minchas chavitim, you should be able to mekadesh it l'chatzoyin, is leilif midam. Why not derive conclusions from dam and say that just like in dam, according to Rabbi Lazar, there's no kiddush l'chatzoyin, so too the minchas chavitin, and for that matter all menachos, should not be subject or should not lend themselves to kiddush l'chatzoyin. Why can't we derive conclusions about menachos from dam in zvachim? V'chitem, maybe you'll counter and you'll say no. Rabbi Lazar milsa mimilsa lo gamar. Rabbi Lazar holds that in kodshim we have a special limitation rule that we don't compare one to another. You don't compare karbanos and derive conclusions one to the other. That's not so. V'amar Rabbi Lazar, mincha shekmotza behechal kshera. Well, we'll have a whole sugi about this coming up on Amid Beis, which means that the kmitza of a mincha should take place in the Azor, but he went ahead and took the mincha into the heichal, right, into the heichal where the shulchan is and the zbeich hapnimi and the menorah. He went into the heichal and he did the kmitza inside the heichal. And Rabbi Loza says kshera. Why? How does Rabbi Loza know that even if he brought the mincha from the Azora into the Heichal and did the Kmitza in the Heichal, that it's valid? And the answer is Shekei Matzina B'Siluk B'Zichen. He derives it from the law of Lechem Aponim, because in Lechem Aponim, in addition to the loaves of bread, 6 on each side of the Shulchan, there was also 2 bazichin of lavona, 2 spoonfuls of lavona, kind of a spice, which had to accompany the lechem aponim. In fact, not just to accompany the lechem aponim, but the shnei bazichin, and that's going to be part of the sugi. That's why I'm emphasizing it up front. Is the matir of the lechem, meaning just like in mincha we have kmitza, and then we have the kmitza is burnt on the mizbeach haktorah. Then we have the shirayim, the remainder of the mincha beyond the kmitza. So too, in a very striking parallel, we have the bazichin, and we take the bazichin off the shulchan, and that's called siluk. And when we take the bazichin off the shulchan, then it allows for the lechem aponim to be eaten. So the lechem aponim parallel the shirayim of the kmitza, and therefore the act of siluk habazichin is equivalent to kmitza. Now he went ahead, and as every Shabbos, the Kohanim, when they remove the bazichin, they do so in the heichal. And that is mativ the lechem aponim. So that the kmitza of lechem aponim is the siluk habazichin, and that is implemented in the heichal. That's how it has to be. It's there with the shulchan. And now Rabbi Lazar is going to derive the conclusion that the kmitza in menachos can be implemented in the heichal, just like the shnei bazichin are removed as the act of kmitza in the heichal. So you see that Rabbi Lazar is of the opinion that milsa mi milsa gamrinon. So the Gemara answers mincha mi mincha yolif, but mincha mi dam lo yolif. So Gemara now is of the opinion that within the constellation of menachos, Rabbi Lazar could derive one mincha from another, and therefore in lechem aponim, which is a korban mincha, he could derive conclusions about the kmitza of any mincha. But when you're talking, right, and that's as far as doing the kmitza in the heichal. But when you're discussing chatzoin, and now you want to derive it from dam, that just like dam, there's no kiddush l'chatzoin, so too in menachos, there's no kiddush l'chatzoin. That we don't do. We don't derive a mincha from the laws of dam which apply to zvachim, because they're 2 different worlds. Frekti Gemara u mincha mi mincha mi yolef. Are you willing to tell me that from one mincha to another, Rabbi Lazar will derive conclusions, and therefore a mincha shekmotza behechal kosher? Vatanya, what are you going to do with the brisa? Again, now we're talking about lechem haponim. Ad shelo pirka nifras lachma. Now, the lechamim, right, there were 6 and 6 is 12 lechamim for lechem haponim, have to be complete, have to be whole. And nifras lachma means that somebody cut off a piece or broke off a piece of the lechem. That passels the entire lechem upon him, all 12 loaves. But what happens if the prisa, meaning the breaking of the lechem, took place ad shelo pirka, before the siluk of the bazichin? So the halacha is that a lechem pasul, right? Because again, once there was a prisa and the lechem broke, its pasul. And not only that, but according to the first opinion in the Brisa, ein makter olav es habazichin, right? The whole purpose of the bazichin is to be matter the lechem, but the lechem is also. So therefore the bazichin, which is usually burnt on the mizbeach, and aktoras habazichin on the mizbeach is matter the lechem, but here you can't be matter the lechem because it was parus, and therefore you can't burn the bazichin. However, mishaparka nifras lachma, let's say you already removed the bazichin from the shulchan, that's called mishaparka, and then subsequently nifras lachma, the bread was broken, is halechem pasul. Again, the lechem is pasul because inherently it's pasul, it's already porous. But maktir all of us bazichin. Now he can take the bazichin and be maktir on the mizbeach. And apparently Rashi says the same thing applies to a mincha. Forget about lechem aponim for a second, just a classic mincha. If, let's say, after you did the kmitza, part of the mincha was lost, then the halacha is that the shirayim are allowed to be eaten. And not only that, the komitz is burnt on the mizbeach. But Omar Rabbi Elazar says, Lo pirka mamish, we don't have to wait until he actually physically removes the levona, the bazichin from the shtei lechem, from the lechem aponim. All we have to do is wait for the time on Shabbos that we can do the piruk. So the first 6 hours of Shabbos are prior to the piruk. Once we enter into the 7th hour, then it's royal piruk. Afal pishol pirka, he hasn't yet removed the bazichin, but we got to the hour, the time period on Shabbos where you can remove the bazichin. Kimisha pirka damya. We consider as if he already removed the levona in the bazichin. So again, nothing actually in reality has been removed, but the levona is considered that it's roy laktora gavim mizbeach because it's ro'ui lepiruk. It's roy to be taken onto the mizbeach. So the Gemara says, "V'amai, why did Rabbi Elazar make this gigantic step?" And he said that all you have to do is wait for the time period in which the levona is fit for the mizbeach. And even though at this point there was parus and part of the lechem was broken off, tehevi kemincha shechasra kodem kmitza. What's the halach of a mincha that now becomes missing? There's some part that's missing, and it's before the kmitza. That mincha is completely possible. Because the mincha has to be whole at the time of the kmitza. Complete, has to be complete. So now we see that even within the framework of menachos, because Rav Elazar, in the case of the Shnei Badzichin of the Lechem Aponim, was willing to say that as long as it's royal piruk, it doesn't passel. And yet, with regard to mincha, Rabbi Elazar holds that if it was chasera, then it's possible. Why doesn't Rabbi Elazar derive the halachas of one mincha from another mincha, right? From the lechem aponim to a regular mincha. So again, in the case, we have to get the facts down on the ground. In the case that a regular mincha became chaser before kmitza, so that we cannot be kometz the mincha. Why? Because the mincha is chasera. But in the case of lechem aponim, if the lechem aponim became chaser because they broke off a piece, and that took place before kmitza, and again we have to reiterate that the parallel of kmitza in shtel in lechem aponim is the siluk habazichen. Yet Rabbi Elazar rules that we will be makter the levona. So we see that Rabbi Elazar is not holding medam and milsa even within menachos. And the Gemara answers holo kasha. As a general rule, you're right. Rabbi Elazar is committed to derive one mincha from another mincha. And that's why he's going to derive from lechem aponim that if the mincha was, the kmitza of the mincha was done in the heichal, it's ksher. But why in this particular case of chaser, of parus, does Rabbi Elazar refuse to compare and make an analogy between the lechem aponim and other minchas? Because mincha lo briri kometz didei. In the case of a regular mincha, we don't know where the kometz is. It could be taken off anywhere from the mincha. There's no specific place. But for ha, in the case of lechem aponim, brira kometz didei, right? The kometz is the levona that's in the shtei abazichen, and we know exactly where the levona is. It's separated from the lechem on the shulchan. The kaven shigias man lefare keman de parkadomi. Therefore, Rabbi Elazar applied this logical rule that we don't have to wait until the actual removal of the bazichin. It's enough that we got to that seventh hour, the time which is roy for piruk. And that's because the levona was always separated from the from the lechem aponim. So the Gemara says, wait a minute, Elameatu tehevi kishirayim shechosru ben kmitza laktara. Now, kmitza does two things. Number one, it sets up the kometz itself for haktar al gabi mizbech. And number two, it's matir the shirayim for achilas kohen. Now, what happens if part of the mincha was removed, was lost, after the kmitza, but before the haktar al gabi mizbeach? And the halacha is the ein maktirin kometz aleim. In that case, the burning of the kometz is meant to accomplish the goal of being matir the shirayim lachilas kohenim. But here, in this case, we cannot be matir the kometz. Why? Because the kometz is designated to be matir the shirayim, and the mincha is chasera. Part of the shirayim were lost. So there's no point to being matir the kometz if there's no possibility of setting up achilas shirayim. So now we're talking about bein kmitza lehaktara, meaning that it became chaser after the kmitza was done. And yet, the mincha is possible. You can't be matir the shirayim. You can't be matir the kometz on the mizbeach. So you want to tell me that since it's a shah haru'uyel piruk, as if he already took the shtei bazichin and removed them, even though he hasn't removed them yet, but the hour that's designated for the removal has come. Well, guess what? Even after the removal, even after the siluk or piruk of the shtei bazichin, which again is parallel to the kmitza in Menchos, if it became chaser, at that point, then ein maktirin kometz aleim. So we're not going to be maktir the shtei bazichin on the mizbeach. So this whole business doesn't make any sense. So the Gemara asks, "V'lav plukta ninu." Wait a minute, you're assuming that which is dependent upon a controversy. Maybe Rabbi Lazar, Savra lo Kemandi Omer Shirayim Shechasu Ben Kmitzalak Torah Maktirin Kometz Aleim. Okay, now let's get back to the problem of Chatzoyin. Gufa, we learned above. Chavite Kohen Gadol, Rabbi Yochanan Omar Eina Kedosh LeChatzoyin, Rabbi Lazar Omer, Mitoch Shekrevel Chatzoyim, Kedosh LeChatzoyim. Okay, Rabbi Lazar makes a lot of sense. We know that the hakrava of the chavitin of the Kohen Gadol is split into the morning and the evening, and therefore it makes sense that there's kiddush in the kli lechatzoyim in two separate acts of kiddush. But what about Rabbi Yochanan? Omar Rav Acha. My time of the Rabbi Yochanan, Omar Kra Mincha Mechatzisa. Okay, so here you have to know exactly where the pasuk is and how we derive it from the pasuk. Omar Kra, the pasuk says in Vayikra Perik Vav, it says Mincha Tamid Mechatzisa Vaboker Mechatzisa Ba'erev. Half in the morning. But it's machtzisa, half of it. So it means that initially it was full, and then he took off half. So therefore, hevi mincha v'achkach chotzei. He's got to bring a complete mincha, and then he can split it in half for the morning, half for the evening. Meisvei, that's interesting. The Gemara doesn't ask how Rabbi Lazar interpreted this pasuk. But anyway, Meisvei, we have a brayso that says Chaviti Kohen Gadol. Lo hayu bos chatzoin. When the Kohen Gadol brings his flour from his house to the Beis HaMikdash, he doesn't bring it in halves. Elamevi isaron sholem, right? The volume of the mincha has to be a full isaron, half in the morning, half in the evening, but he's got to bring the full isaron, the chotzeu, and then he divides it up. Half isaron, half isaron. The Tanya we learned in the brayso, ilu nemar mincha machtzis. Right, so what does it say? It says here in Machzisa with regard to the chavitin of the Kohen Gadol, and ilu nemar mincha mechtzis hayisi over maybe chatzi isaron mi beso shachris umakriv chatzi isaron mi beso arvis umakriv tameloar machtzisa. So if I'm not mistaken, the Gemara is deriving it from the extra hey at the end of the word machtzisa. If it would have said machtzis, so let him bring half and let him bring another half. But since it says machtzisa, it means machtzah mishalem, he splits it from shalem, who maybe. So he's got to bring it. In any event, both of these braisos assume that there's no kiddush l'chatzoin. He's got to originally bring the entire volume of the isaron, a full isaron, in one kli. So the Gemara tries to answer the mitzvah. Maybe Rabbi Elazar is only saying that when you need to bring the entire mincha as a whole, and not in chatzon, that's only for the mitzvah. But as far as the kiddush is concerned, for the evid, let's say he didn't fulfill the mitzvah, and the kiddush would be accomplished even b'lechatzoin. Amalei Rav Gvia mi Bei Ksila came from a place called Bei Ksila. Rav Ashi v'chuka ksiv Bei. We have a rule that wherever the word chuka appears in the context of karbanos, it's always an absolute critical requirement, and therefore here the pasuk says chak olam, right, in Vayikra Vav that we mentioned earlier, and chok means a statute that's absolutely critical. So you can't tell me it's just the mitzvah. Amalei, so Rav Ashi replies to Rav Gavia, Lo nitzcha el lavia sholimi beso. In other words, you're right. It's critical that he brings the entire isaron for the minchas chavitin from his house, but once he has done so, and he brought the full isaron from his house, then he could divide it up and be makadosh it. So that's how Rabbi Elazar would interpret these brisos. That enochinami, initially, it's a chok. It's critical that he brings the Kohen Gadol brings the entire isaron as a full isaron. Nothing less will do. But later on, once he's brought them already, now he can go ahead and divide it half for isaron for the morning, half isaron for the evening. Is it really true that according to Rabbi Yochanan, there's no kiddush mincha lechatzon? It has to be brought all together in one shot. V'itma, we learned hifrish. Okay, now we have machlokas Rav and Rabbi Yochanan. Hifrish chatzi isaron v'daita lahosif. Rav Hamarina Kodesh, Rabbi Yochanan Amar Kodesh, V'Meisa Leilif Michavitin. Okay, so now the Gemara is saying the following. We have a machlokas between Rav and Rabbi Yochanan about a case where he was mafresh and he was makadesh half an isaron. His das was to add the other half of isaron. Rav says it's not kadosh. Why? Because it's lechatzoin. But Rav Yochanan says it is kadosh. And we're talking about the minchas chavitin, and now we should derive the conclusion that Rav Yochanan should be consistent. And if he holds kadosh means there is a kiddush lechatzoin in the case of minchas chavitin, then he should apply that same rule to a regular mincha. And yet Rabbi Yochanan says in Menachos, there's no kiddush lechatzoin. Chitein Rabbi Yochanan milsa lo yoliv. Don't argue that Rabbi Yochanan maintains that in Kodshim you can't derive one from another. Hamar Rabbi Yochanan shlomim sheshchata beheichal ksherin. If you shechted a shlomim, which should have been done in the Azor, but he did it in the heichal, then it's kosher. D'chsiv ushchato pesach oel moed. Meaning in the Azara, you shech in the parish of Shlomim, shalotei tofel chomer mi'ikar. Because Heichal is that much more kadosh, more chamur than the Azara. So if the shechita could be done, as the Torah says, in the Azara, then the shechita could be certainly done in the Heichal. And it's interesting, now the Gemara is saying that midamin and milsa, and how do you see that? Because he's comparing the Azar to the Heichal. So again, what we're trying to say is, in the case of Minchas Chavita in Rav Yochanan said Kadosh, even though it was Lechatzoin. Why doesn't he apply that to all menachos. And the Gemara answers that daito lahosif shiny. In other words, even though he has only chatzoin and he's missing half, but nevertheless his intention was to bring the other half. And that's where Rabbi Yochanan says that this kiddush lechatzoin. But in Minchas Chavitin, there was no such kavana or das to be Mosif. Desanya, Maleim, the Torah says with regard to the kli in which you bring the mincha, it's got to be Maleim, it's got to have the kemach, the flour, and the oil, and the lavona, whatever it is, it's got to be there in the kli. Ein Maleim ela shleimim, it's got to be complete. So in other words, the Brisa says that there's no such thing as lichatzoin. It's got to be complete. V'yamar Rabbi Yossi, Emosai, bisman she'ein daita lahosif, bisman she'daita lahosif, rishon kadosh. So when do we say that you need shleimim? That's only because it's ein daito lahosif. But if it's daita lahosif, then that's considered shleimim. So the Gemara now wants to know, Rav bechavitin keman svirale. So we have machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar regarding chavitin, and where does Rav stand? Iki Rabbi Elazar, if he agrees with Rabbi Elazar that there is kiddush lechatzoin in chavitin, is leilif mi chavitin. Why doesn't he compare all menachos to chavitin and derive the conclusion that you could be makadosh at lechatzoin? V'chithem Rav Milson lo yolif ha'amar Rav mincha kidosha below shemen. Now this is really interesting. The mincha requires shemen in most cases, and yet Rav says that I can validate a kiddush in a kli with the flour but without the kemach. And from whence does Rav derive that? Shekain matzinu b'lechem aponim, that there's kiddush below levona. So you makadesh the lechem aponim when you put it on the shulchan, and the levona is a separate kiddush. And not only that, shekain matzinu b'minchas nechsachim, below shemen below levona. Shekain matzinu b'minchas chotei. Anyway, we see from all these analogies that Rav derives one halach from another. In other words, mitamina milsa milsa. Al kolkach Rav Rabbi Yochanan sfirale. We have no choice but to say that Rav agrees with Rabbi Yochanan that the chavitin themselves did not lend themselves to kiddush, because if Rav would hold that there is kiddush l'chatzoin in the case of what? Of chavitin, then he would derive all menachos from chavitin. Gufa marav mincha kidosh below shemen. You can sanctify the flour without the oil. Shekei matzina b'lechem aponim. That you can be makadesh the lechem below levona. Shekei matzina b'minchas nesachim below shemen u below levona. You can be makadesh the mincha without shemen and without levona. Shekei matzina b'minchas chotei. Shemen ulevona kodshi high. Below high, v'high below high. Right, so the shemen and the levona for a mincha, right? The levona is also added to most minachos, and they can each have their own kiddush. How so? Shemen shekei matzina below shemen shel mitzora. Levona shekei matzina below levona. So we find precedence for a kiddush levona on its own in the case of bezichin, and we have a kiddush of the shemen alone in the case of mitzora. So that's all according to whom? That's according to Rav. But Rab Chanina argues. He has a different shita.